Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring this video where I'm going to be going over unit testing in React. So I know this is a topic that I've talked about in the past. I actually made a video on it, on how to work with the React testing library. It was really well received, and for that reason I decided to make another one which goes more in depth, shows more like in real life examples, and I just overall explain it better. Unit testing is something that a lot of people don't like. I know how it is, like people don't find it as useful, especially in the beginning. However, it is extremely important to maintain your code well organized, and also it helps you find bugs like 100%. Studies have shown that it actually decreases the time it takes for you to find bugs by almost 80%. I'm not sure how reliable those studies are. However, I just know that overall, if you've been testing for a while, you'll realize how important it actually is and how much it helps in the long run. And for most people, they just want to learn testing because you will need to do unit testing in every single job. Most jobs want to maintain their code want to maintain a good code coverage, want to test everything in order to prevent some bugs or errors from occurring. So it is definitely important for the developers to continuously test their code, even if it seems redundant, because sometimes it does. Many people will eventually have to do this, so it's nice to have this skill. And in React, there is three libraries, but different combinations of those three libraries, which are very commonly used. So the first one is a combination between the React testing library and Jest. So you can see that when we open up a React application, and I'll go over what this React application is that I have already built over here. But basically, if you open up an application and go to your package.json, you'll see that usually when you run create React app, it will come with this over here. So the React testing library and includes Jest as well. So this is a standard combination, and it is the one we're going to be using in this video. However, if you guys are interested in seeing a video where I use Enzyme instead of React testing library, I can definitely do that too. It's also a very famous combination, and all the libraries existent are well maintained and works pretty well. So in order to make this video more intuitive, I built this simple React application that will cover most of the different aspects from testing. So you can see right here we have a very simple web app. It exists inside of our app.js, and it renders two different components, as you can see over here. One component called input and one component called button. So in the front end, when you see the website, this is what you see. You see an input, and when you type on this input, a text will appear showing whatever you're typing, right? And also, when you click over here, you'll see another button will appear. Those are the two different things. And there's also this thing over here which is saying, hey, my name is Pedro, please subscribe, I would be very happy, please. If you come over here to your component, in the app.js there's a state. If you set this equal to false, you'll see that this won't show. So why did I do this? Well, I know this web app is like, it makes no sense. It definitely doesn't, like, why would someone make this? However, it definitely shows the different aspects that are important to learn and the different skills that you need to execute when you're testing your application. The first skill that we need to execute is the fact that we have a button. So I'm gonna write some tests for this button component. The button component is this over here. You can see it's very simple. All it has is a state called show another button. It is set to false. And when you click on the button, it just set show another button to true. So it basically shows the button, right? This is the logic for showing the button. So when we click on the button, it will show another button. And you can clearly see right now that I added some properties to our tags, which you might find weird if you're not used to testing. So what happens is, when you're testing, you need to actually grab the individual elements inside of your component. So a way to differentiate them is by adding this property right here, which is data test ID. You can do this in many different ways. I like using data test ID. People may say that, like, oh, it's you can see it in the front end. I don't think it's that big of a deal. However, do your own research on this case. You can search it by so many things. You can search it by role. You can search it by I don't know, title. You can search an input by however way you want to. I like using this tag to differentiate the actual elements. And in this case, I gave the test ID of button for both of them for a particular reason. So if you go to the input, you'll see that we have another component. This component is a little bit different. We have a prop being passed called show div. We have a state inside of here. and we have an input. In the input, if you search on the input, it will basically change this state called search word to be equal to whatever you write on that input. And over here, it just displays that actual state. So this is what's happening right here. When we write here, it shows what we're writing. And over here at the bottom, we have this thing where if the prop show div is equal to true, then we display the div as I mentioned before. Now the test IDs that I put over here are different. You can see that for the search bar, for the input it's search bar, and for the div it's div we want to show. And this is also display search. Normally you want to give a different one for each element in order to differentiate them. There's a reason why I did it for the button, and you guys will see in a bit. So now that we have our components already built, we already know and understand how they work, how do we test this logic? So the first test that I'm actually going to write is for the input.js, not the button. I'll get to the button in a bit. So for the input, we got to really think about what we want to test and how can we actually test it. So to create a test file, you just go here to your components file or wherever you have your actual component, and you create a new file which has the same name as your component, so input, then .test.js. And the reason why we put the .test is because when we run a certain command in our command line, React will automatically check for all the files with this extension and run the test on all of them. So it is necessary that we put this little extension .test because it will eventually help us when we're running our tests. So over here, we can write all the tests that we want, but we really need to think about what we want to test. So in this component, we see we have some UI stuff, we have some logic. What are the things we want to test? Well, I'm thinking right off the bat, the first thing I want to test is whether or not this input shows, right? If this input's render. When we render this component, we want to make sure that this over here is also rendered, because if it isn't, then we're basically rendering an input component without an actual input inside of it. And the second thing we want to test is if I write on this input, what will happen here, right? We want to test to see if I write on this input, the text inside of this h1 will be equal to whatever we wrote inside of this input. And this is important because this is testing logic. We're testing to see if our state, as our state changes, our actual application will update accordingly. And finally, we want to test to see if I pass this component with a value for its prop, which is false. We want to test to see that this doesn't show up, but if it's true, we want to test to see if this shows up. And it will become clearer as we write our tests, so let's start doing it. Okay, so in this file, the first thing we want to do is we want to import some stuff from the testing library. So we're going to say import from @testing library React. And what we want to render, or what we want to import for now is, first of all, just the render function over here. We're going to import more stuff, but as we go, I'll keep importing. Then we want to import our actual input. So to do that, we're going to come over here and say import, and we want to import a component called input from ./input over here. So we need to import our actual component that we're testing. And now that we have that done, we already basically have all the functionality that we need. To actually start an actual testing site, there's many ways you can do it. What I like to do is I like to use the describe keyword, which basically allows you to describe a whole test case. So you're testing this component. So for every component, I just describe what I'm doing. So let's call it input component test. This isn't for this won't do anything to your actual test. All it does is it organizes your tests so that you know that this is the test for the whole input component, and everything individually inside of that component will be inside of this describe. So the actual test will run whenever you use either one of these two keywords. When you use the test keyword or the it keyword. I like to use the it keyword. I don't know why. I just use it. I'm just used to using it, and a lot of people use it as well. So this is what I'm going to be using it in this tutorial. So when you use the it keyword, basically you're describing a certain event inside of this component. So the first thing we want to test is if there is if it rendered the actual input. So what we want to do is we're going to say, well, let's call this test rendered input. So this is just a name for the test, and then we pass a function over here which is going to write the logic for testing this actual logic. So how do we test if it actually rendered the input? So there's a function in the React testing library, which is the render function, which is what we imported over here, and you use it to actually render the input as a mock of the input. So we're gonna come over here and say const and set it equal to render, and we just pass over here the actual input that we're testing. So I'll just say input like this. And you don't need to pass the props. I know that input has props. You can pass it if you want to, but let's just do it right now. Let's pass the prop show div, and let's just set it equal to false. It doesn't really matter because this test is specifically, it's just testing to see if this input appears. So now what we want to do is we want to grab from this render some sort of identifier, some sort of function that will help us grab elements inside of this component. And this is what I'm talking about. There's many functions you can grab from here, but the one we're going to be using is the get by test ID. And you can grab by many things. This is just a way to identify which elements inside of this component you're trying to access and trying to test. So when we say get by test ID, I can access a certain element inside of here by just saying something like let's just grab the input and say something like const input equals to get by test ID, and pass the test ID for this input. So I'll pass the search bar over here, and I'll just put a string as well. And now we actually grabbed the input inside of the component. And what we want to test here is we want to test to see if this actually appears. And whenever you want to assert something or you want to test something to be true or not, you use the expect keyword like this, and over here inside of this expect function you put what you're going to test. So like in this case we're going to put the input inside of here. So I expect that this input will be something, right? And we can test many things, but in this case we just want to test to see if that input appears. So the way we test that is we can use the to be truthy function, and this all it does is it just says true or false whether or not this appears in the actual DOM. So in this case this should run and work out, and we're going to test it right now. So when you have a test like this, as I told you guys, it will basically go over all your application and search for .test files. So to run every single test in this in our project, we just say yarn, or if you're using npm you can use npm, and then use test. That's the command we run. And when I click this, you'll see it will start searching for every single file, in our case just one of them, and it should start testing for that file specifically. And as you can see, the test has passed. If we did something weird, like instead of saying that we expected it to be true, we said that we expected it to be falsy, which is basically the opposite, it wouldn't have run. You can see it will say it failed the test. And one thing that's interesting as well is when you run the yarn test command, it will keep running as long as you save the file. So I can change this, just save the file and it will automatically run again. You don't need to run the command multiple times. So what I want to do now is I want to start testing more logical stuff. So for example, I want to test to see if we render this component with a different prop. So if the prop is true, I want to show the div. If the prop is false, I don't want to show this div right here. So the way to do this is we're going to come over here and we're going to create two different tests. I'm going to say it, and this test will be render div. And it's going to be very similar to the other one that we made, like this. And then we need to just close this. And then we're going to create another test, which is don't render the div, or yeah, let's just say don't render div, something like that. And both of these tests will be very similar. The difference is that we're going to be passing different props to our component. So I'm going to grab this over here, and I'm going to say, okay, the first one is we want to render the div. So we're going to pass the prop as true, and we're going to grab by ID. And what we want to do is we want to grab the div, let's call it div, equals to get by test ID. And the test ID that we put in our div is the div we want to show. So we just grab this over here. We identify that this is the actual element that we're talking about. And at the end, and we can just say that we expect the div that we try to get to be truthy as well, like this, because we passed the prop as true, so it must render this div. You can see that if we save this, it will automatically run the test again, and you can see that now it says one test suit, because this is a test suit and there's only one, but in individual tests 3 has passed. And the reason why 3 has passed is because we haven't put anything here yet, so it automatically assumes that it passed. But the good thing we know is that none of them failed, so this one also passed. Now let's test the fact that if we pass a prop, which is false, it shouldn't render the div. So let's just come over here and do the same thing, but now pass this false and grab the same div, but instead of being truthy, we need to see if it is falsy. And if we run this, it should still say that it passed, but it says it didn't pass. And let's see what's the problem with this. It said that get test by ID didn't work. And I know why it didn't work. In this case specifically, we need to know that sometimes it shouldn't actually appear, right? Because normally when you look at the input in itself, there's no elements with this certain test ID. So in this case, we want to use a different function, which is the query by test ID. And if we use this instead of the get by test ID, it should actually work. As you can see, it passed because when we use the get by test ID, it only works for elements that specifically are already pre-rendered. When you render the component, it will pre-render into the DOM. And in this case over here, since it is gated by a state, it won't work with the get by test ID, so we need to use the query by test ID. Again, if you want to look at all the functions that you can use from Jest to actually query stuff, to get stuff, there's many different resources online. I'm going to definitely put a link in the description where you can look at the documentation. You can use whichever one you want, and it's very easy to read, so I would definitely recommend so. Now that we actually tested the logic for the prompts and we tested to see if the input is actually rendering, let's do the final test, which is probably the most important one. We want to test to see if we write on this input, if we fire an event where we write on this input, we want to see if this h1 tag over here will actually display the actual word in which we wrote in this input. So to do that, we're going to come over here, create a new test, and let's say change on input causes change on header. And I call it like this because we want to say that when we change something inside of the input, when we write on the input, we will change the value from this header over here. So let's just pass the function like this. And one thing that is important to understand is whenever you're dealing with something that will change an individual state from the application, and in this case it would be because we created a state over here, and when we modify the state, we want our application to modify together with us. So when we are dealing with a situation like this, you actually need to wrap your test around with an act function like this. And this is extremely important because if you don't, then it won't re-render the actual component that you're trying to render if there's a change in the state, which means that you won't be able to see the change in the state. So whenever you're changing something individually inside of your component, a state that exists inside of your component, so it wouldn't be true in this case over here because the state for show div, it's not inside of the input component. It's outside of it. It's in the app.js. So if you have a state that is inside of the component and it will change throughout the test, you need to wrap it around with this act function. So inside of this act function, what we want to do is we want to first of all get by ID. Again, we're going to get by test ID instead of rendering or querying like this. And we just want to grab the input as a whole, right? So what we want to do is we want to use this get by ID to get our input. So I'm going to say const input equals to the same thing that we did over here. Just grab the search bar. And now what we want to do is we want to use a function from the React testing library, which is the fire event function. And this over here allows you to simulate events inside of your application, which is amazing because we want to simulate a person writing on this input. So to simulate it, all we have to do is we have to fire an event and then say dot change because it is a change event. And right over here, we pass two different properties. First of all, the element that we're trying to change, so the input. And then we have to write a little bit of syntax that looks a little bit of like a little bit weird, but all we're doing is we're modifying certain aspects of this input. So each input has a target, right? So we can say that we want to modify the target like this. And instead of the target, each input has a value, and that value will represent the actual value inside of the input. So what is currently written inside of the input. So all we have to do is we want to modify the input and modify its target and modify inside of that target its value to be equal to something. So let's create a variable over here. Let's just say we want to write my name. So let me say input word and let's put Pedro. So all we're doing is we want to say that we want to simulate someone writing Pedro inside of this input. So I'm just going to put the variable over here, and now what we want to do is we want to expect that since someone wrote that inside of the input, we want to expect that the header will now contain the same word, so the same input word inside of it. But we haven't grabbed the actual header yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab over here, and we're also going to grab the header. Not only the input, but we're going to grab the header, and the actual tag for the header is display search, as you can see over here. We're going to put it inside of here, and now we have access to both of them. So what I want to do is I want to say expect header dot, and then when you put a dot, you can access individual properties from every HTML element. For example, if I have a header like this one over here, and I want to access the text that is inside of this header, I can very easily do that by just accessing its inner HTML like this. So this will represent the actual text inside of the header. So if we want to compare it, we want to expect it to be equal to the actual input word, because that's what we're typing on our input. Now, on purpose, I don't know if you guys realize, but on purpose, I left a little bug that I'll show you guys when we run this. If I save this over here, first of all, you'll see it won't pass. It will say that it received nothing when it was expecting to receive Pedro, because Pedro is the input word that we put. The reason for that is because we need to take into account that we wanted this to be done before this is executed, and currently this is not happening. So this means that we need to make all of this asynchronous. So to do this, we just come over here, we turn this function asynchronous, and we just say that before we continue to move here, we want to wait for the event to be executed. And if I save this now, you'll see that it should actually pass the tests. It will give us this warning over here, and if you want to fix this warning, you just have to make the it function over here also asynchronous and wait for the act to be done. So when you save this, you'll see that it will still pass, and actually it won't pass, and this is the bug that I left for you guys. It won't pass because of the following reason. So you can see over here, it's saying that it expected Pedro, but it received Pedro, but with a space in front of it. And the reason for that is because I did leave this space over here. And the reason for that is if you are going to do unit testing, make sure you know exactly what you're doing. This space could have meant a little padding or a little bit of space in my front end. So you need to really be sure of what you're actually writing. And this kind of minor errors are easily overlooked when you're not unit testing like this. So when I save it, you can see it clearly. It works. All the tests have passed because it knows exactly what's happening, and we're simulating the component in a correct way. So now this is pretty much it for this input component. We tested most of it. We tested the UI, that everything is rendering completely. We tested that the props actually have an effect on it by showing the div or not showing the div. And finally, we tested its individual logic by using its states and also triggering events such as a change in the input. Now we want to write some tests for the button. So I want to create a new file over here called button.test.js, and honestly, I'll just copy everything that we wrote here in our input, and I'll just paste them over here. But we're gonna obviously change everything because we're writing tests for the button. First thing we want to change is we want to import the button instead of the input over here, like this. And now we also want to change this to be the button component. That's the name that we're describing. That's the test suite that we're running. And one thing that we want to realize is we really need to stop and think, what do we want to test? So the first thing I want to test is, let me just open up the component. I want to test that this button actually renders. So I just want to see if this renders. If it doesn't, then clearly there's something wrong in our application. So to do that, very simply, we'll just say rendered button. We'll get by ID. We'll render the button instead of the input component. And this button component doesn't have any props, so let's just delete this. And we passed the data test ID for the button, and we called it button. So I'll just copy this, paste it over here, and we're just expecting the button to be truthy. And this should run perfectly, right? Let me just copy this over here and paste it over here. I'm going to delete all of this because this doesn't make any sense, at least in this context. But you can see that everything should be working. And if I run this, you can see we have now two test suites, because now we have the button component test suite and the input component test suite. And every test inside of it passed completely, which is great. But the next test, which is the last test we're going to be running, is we're going to be trying to trigger a click on the button. And you can see that when we click on the button, it just renders another button, very almost the same thing. It's the exact same button, just doesn't have another click event, as you can see. And why are we doing it this way is because you can actually check and query for all the buttons inside of your application. And you can do that for every single element. You can query for all the inputs, you can query for all the divs, all the header tags, all the, like every single element possible. And you can arrange them in an array. And you can check to see the length of that array specifically, which means you're checking to see how many buttons are in that component, which is something that you might want to do in many different situations. So what I want to test is that when I click on this button, like initially before I click on the button, there should be only one button in the component. So I'm going to check for the length of all the buttons, and it should be 1. But when I click on it, it should update and show that the length of all the buttons is 2, because now there's 2 buttons in our screen. So let's test to see if this is working. I'll come over here and I'll just say that create a new test. Let's say it, and let's say render one button before button click, something like that. I know the name. I like the name is horrible. I'm horrible with giving names, but let's just create this test. And all we want to do is we want to first of all just check to see how many buttons are in the screen. So when you render the component, before you actually click on the button, we're gonna use this function from the renderer. So let's say const equal to render, and let's render the button like this. And we want to use this function called query. Or no, actually, let's not use query. Let's just use get all by test ID. So the difference between get all by test ID and get by test ID is just that this one will get every element with the same test ID, and you can see that we actually gave the same test ID for both of them. And the other one will just get 1, similar to get all elements by ID in normal JavaScript, and just get element by ID. Yeah, this one will return an array. Even if there's only one element, it will return an array with all the elements with this specific test ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to create something over here called button list, and say that we want to get all by test ID and pass the test ID that we're trying to grab, which is the button one. And finally, we want to say that we expect the button list like this, and then we can use this function, which is the to have length, like this, to have length, and we can put a certain value over here. So the length will be 1, because right now when you render the component, it should only have 1 button. Let's save this and let's check to see if this is actually true. Let's open this, and you can see that now our new test passed, and it's working perfectly. Now let's simulate a button click and check to see if the length it becomes 2. So let's copy this over here, paste it over here, change this to render 2 buttons after button click. And now what we want to do is we want to grab all the elements, all the buttons, right? And we want to again simulate an event that triggers a state. So you can see that we have a state over here, which is this one over here. And every time you want to trigger a state, every time you want to change a state, you want to wrap all of this around with an act function. And I mentioned this before, so we have to do it again. We're going to wrap all of this with the act, and now all the change in states will be replicated in the test. So what we have to do before we expect anything is we want to fire the event. So I want to fire an event, which is a click event. So I want to click on something, and the thing that I want to click is the actual button, but the first button. So initially, as you recall, this should return a list. But the thing is, initially before we click on anything, it should only have 1 button. So we're going to say that we want to grab the first button in the list, and we want to click on that one, which is the actual button which triggers the state change and it shows the other button. So when we do this, we expect the button list to have length 2. And this is not completely right, and I hope you guys notice the error, because you'll see it won't pass. You see, it doesn't pass. It actually doesn't work at all. It says the button is not defined. Actually, button is not defined because I need to call it button list, but it will still fail, and you'll see why. Over here, it will say that it doesn't have length 2, it has length 1. And why is that happening? Well, because we need to make this asynchronous. Why? Because when we click on this button, this is being executed before the state change, so it still has 1 button. So we need to make this over here an async function, make this await, and then make this async like we did before, and make this await as well, like this. And finally, before we run the test to see if it works, there's a final bug that I left here, which is, think about it this way. This over here will grab all the buttons that exist in the DOM right now. So it doesn't include the second one. Then we wait for the event to happen, and then we check to see if that same list has a length of 2. Why would it have a length of 2? It's a constant, right? It doesn't change based on this. What we have to do is, we just have to grab all the buttons again and check to see if it has a length of 2. This over here was the old the old size, the old list. It won't change automatically, but if we try to get everything again, now it will have the updated value. So if we open up this, we run this, you should see that now everything has passed, 7 tests has passed, and we actually successfully were able to write some tests for 2 components. It is pretty fast. I know it's annoying to write tests, but it definitely helps out, and as you do more of them, it definitely gets quicker. I remember I spent the first time I wrote tests was for my startup job, and it took me like 2 days to figure out like how to write a test for a small component, because I was trying to do crazy stuff. Like I was trying to test like every single aspect of the component, which isn't like what you need to do. Like obviously the more tests you write, the better, the more code coverage, but like don't waste your time completely on it. Spend your time writing tests for the most important aspects of the component and then move on. If you write your tests and you don't find any errors, there's likely no errors in your component. But if there is a major error in your component and you write tests correctly, you'll definitely find that error while you're writing your tests. So that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting 2 to 3 times a week and I will massively appreciate it. If you're interested in joining my membership program, just click the join button down in the description. I launched this last week and I'm really excited. So yeah, that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed it and I see you guys next time.